All right, welcome back, everybody. Mark Davis, St. Mark, Tech Study, and here's the schedule. We'll put this video up on Monday. We'll discuss it on Wednesday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time. If you want to be added to our invitation list and get the Zoom link for this discussion, just write us here. If you have any questions, you want to communicate at all, this is how you do it. Okay, so today we're going to be down on the text from Luke chapter 6, verses 27 through 38. So this follows directly from what we studied last week, and let's get right to it. Jesus is speaking. But I say to you that listen, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Give to everyone who begs from you. And if anyone takes away your goods, do not ask for them again. Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. If you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much again. But love your enemies, do good, and lend, expecting nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, for God, He is kind to the grateful and to the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For the measure with which you give will be the measure you get back. This ends the reading. Thanks be to God. Okay, so I want to just start out with a couple of comments before we actually start attending to verse by verse of the text. And the first is that whenever we begin reading a text that begins with the word but, like this one does when Jesus says, but I say to you that listen, right? When we see a text that begins with the word but, it really encourages us to go back and to see what was said before, because this word translated but, this is not always true when you see the word but in English translations of Greek. Sometimes it's the article day, which could be but or perhaps, or the and or then. Very, very many possibilities for day. But this one is Allah, which really indicates contrast from what's been said before. So when you see a text that begins with but, you know that we're starting in the middle of a thought. And so anytime you run across that in your text studies, you want to back up and see, but what? Same thing if you see the word therefore, right? What's there for? You want to back up and see where's the flow, because we're jumping in the middle of something. And in this case, Jesus has just talked about woe to you when people speak well of you, because that's what their ancestors did to the false prophets. And it seems to me that that's the flow, that's the idea with which Jesus introduces this idea. But I say to you, don't live that way, live this way, okay? Now, I need to also just make one very strong note before we launch in, and I'm saying it now so that I won't have to say it verse by verse by verse and kind of demonstrate how the verses have been misunderstood over time. We read a text about being slapped on the cheek and turning the other cheek. We read a text about non-retaliation. We read a text that encourages us to pray for those who abuse us. And it seems to me that these texts are often interpreted wrongly. And I don't know if people who are being abused or victims of violence actually interpret these texts wrongly, but I'm relatively sure some of their pastoral counselors over the years, pastors mostly, have encouraged them. They've encouraged women to stay in an abusive marriage over texts like this that say, pray for those who abuse you. I think that's a fundamental misreading of this text, particularly if we pay attention to the power dynamics that are assumed in this text. This text assumes that the people to whom Jesus is talking, so Jesus is assuming that the people to whom he is talking have the power to retaliate, have the power not to lend or to lend. So what we're talking about here in terms of the power balance is Jesus is speaking to people with power. He's not speaking to people who are victims of those with power. And that's a huge, huge point to keep in mind with all of these that we read, because if we forget that, then it can look like what Jesus is arguing is for some sort of quietism in the face of abuse. Jesus is not talking to victims of spousal or child abuse here. He's not talking to someone who is a victim of someone else exercising power in the worst ways. He's talking to people who have the power to retaliate and to strike back, to do otherwise, and is encouraging them in a path of non-retaliation. So, as I see it, when we read this text, we have to balance an absolutely firm non-retaliation that's coming from Jesus with an absolutely firm conviction that abuse of power is wrong. And so we're not going to take these texts and twist them in a way that encourages victims just to sit there in their victimhood and hope that everything works out. Okay? If you want to see how this plays out verse by verse, I would direct you to my blog, Left Behind and Loving It. And if you go to that blog, you'll see that when this occasion comes up verse by verse, I just can't help myself. I have to offer some cautionary approach to the verse so that they're not misused. That's, however, all I'm going to say about it for the sake of this video, but what I'm saying now reigns supreme over the rest of this text, that's how I read it, and that's how I believe it is faithfully read. I'm not just trying to make it safe or politically correct. I think that's how it's faithfully read. So I leave that with you, and I'll leave it to your own discretion on how it applies verse by verse. Okay? So in this part of the sermon on the level place, Jesus is really offering what we typically call ethics, a way of discerning right and wrong actions, a way of discerning right and wrong emotions even, attitudes and so forth. So what I want to do is outlining it just in terms of the different types of ethical approaches that you will see here in this sermon. And to do that, I'm stepping away from the academic approach to ethics that talk about deontological ethics and teleological ethics and so forth. And I'm letting each section just kind of define its own approach to doing the good. And if that's the case, then I think in verses 27 through 30, you have what we might call alternative ethics, kind of surprising, switching things around, doing what's not expected. In verse 31, we have what I want to call an ego perspective ethics. That's a term I sort of just made up, and I'll try to explain what I mean by that. In verses 32 through 34, we have what I think is a comparative ethics, and I think it's actually one of the funnier parts of this sermon. In verses 35 through 36, we have imitative ethics, which I think is probably a very, very long tradition, particularly among Jewish communities. that the way you honor your ancestry and honor your lineage is that you bear the values that they did, and you ascribe to be like Father Abraham, Mother Sarah, Moses, folks like that. And then verses 37 and 38, I'm calling Boomerang Ethics, and I'll explain what I mean by that when we get to it. So I hope this is helpful. I just think the approach Jesus is offering in each one of these is slightly different, and I want to treat them that way. So that's how we're going to outline what follows. We'll start with verses 27 through 30. This is where Jesus says, love your enemies, do good to haters, right? So this is obviously the fact that that's not what we expect, right? We think that if you have an enemy, you treat them with enmity. And Jesus is saying, love your enemies. If haters, those who hate you, are acting out on that, then you act back. That's kind of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth sort of general approach that most of us take toward how to act toward ugly people, right? And Jesus is saying, no, when people act ugly toward you, you act nicely toward them. Do good to those who hate you. What's really nice about this language is that Jesus is not living in la-la land, so you can't dismiss this sermon as just being idealistic and non-realistic and so forth, because he's acknowledging right here from the start that we have enemies, and there are those who hate us. We live in a world where this stuff happens. The question is not, is that the condition of the world? That's always assumed in the scriptures. That's why there's so much language of violence and stuff, because it's talking about a world that's really rife with that. But in a world that's rife with enemies and hatred, here's something. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless cursers. Pray for abusers. Now, this word bless is not the same one that we saw last week when Jesus said, blessed are. This is the word eulogeo, kind of like in our English word eulogy. Speak well. And when Jesus teaches his disciples to pray, you see the word pray here, right? This comes up fairly often in Luke's gospel. And when they ask Jesus, teach us to pray, part of that is forgive our sins, for we forgive everyone who has sinned against us or who is indebted to us. So the idea of praying for our abusers is already caught up in some respects in the Lord's Prayer. And part of the alternative ethics is to turn the other cheek, right? I've heard it said that slapping someone in the cheek was a public rebuke, and it meant something. It wasn't just somebody losing their cool and starting a fight. This was a public denunciation of somebody and intended to shame them and embarrass them in a culture where honor and shame is very important. And if you deserved it, and someone slapped you on the cheek, well, you were filled with shame. But what happens if you don't deserve it? And what happens? What happens if you do, and someone expects you now to become a retaliatory enemy or something like that? Well, so what I've heard is that when being slapped on the cheek, someone would slap you with their right hand, which was presumed to be the dominant hand for most people, and often shows up in phrases, the right hand of God, as kind of the honored space. And if you turn the other cheek, in order for them to slap you there, they have to switch to their left hand, which in some of these commentaries that I've read, was a shameful thing to do. Now, as a left-handed person, I take offense at that, but, whatever. However, I'm not sure if that's really what was going on in the first century. I'm not sure if there's a lot of historical data to back that up. It sounds suspiciously to me like one of those things that commentators kind of latch on to because it explains things nicely. I want to think of this encouragement to turn the other cheek a little differently. If someone feels justified in smiting you on the cheek publicly as a way of denouncing the way you've acted and shaming you, and you offer them the other cheek, it almost now takes the onus off of you, the recipient, and puts it on them, the one providing that act of shame, and forces them to decide whether you really did act badly enough for this shame or not. And if they can come up with a second slap, because you're darn right you did, you shouldn't have done that, and everybody should make fun of you as a result of what you did, and you should be shamed publicly. Okay. But if not, then why did they slap you in the first place? And so this is almost a non-violent way of forcing that person to really follow through with their violent action and then bring to the table whether that was really justified or not. So the question then doesn't become whether you're shamed or not. It becomes whether they should have done that in the first place or not. That might be what's going on here. I don't know what else. I'm never sure what's being gained by turning the other cheek, except that it is a form of radical non-retaliation. And that seems to be what's going on with this alternative ethic. And then you've got the idea of if someone demands your jacket, you give them your shirt as well. It's almost like when someone forces you to carry a load a mile, you carry it 2 miles just to show that you can serve and get them out of the boss's seat. If someone takes your cloak, you give them your shirt also. That's just kind of an interesting way, again, of saying, if you think it's justified to take my clothing so that I will be chilly at night when you don't need it because you have some grievance against me, then take it off. And when you do, if you think this is a justified way to act, then enjoy it. But if you don't, and you're embarrassed by the fact that I'm now here in my underlinens, and that's all I have as we go into the chill of the night, that's what the whole garment switch thing was about in the Old Testament, then if that's wrong, then why'd you take my cloak in the first place? So again, by pressing it one step further, it really calls the initial action into question. And then the whole idea of give to those who ask of you and don't demand it back. These two words that are translated give and demand back are actually related. The first one is aiteo, and the second one is ap aiteo. So it's the same word with a new prefix. So do something with me for a minute. In terms of the alternative ethics that are going on here, think about how nervous someone is when they're soliciting a loan, right? So the person asking for the loan is nervous. The person from whom they're asking this loan, has all the power here. And you may go to a bank and you may refer to Mr. Smith, who can call you Fred by your first name because you're in this subservient asking, you're begging, as it were. And Mr. Smith has the power in this dynamic to say yes or to say no. Jesus seems to be diffusing that power. Just give to people who ask of you. And don't exercise your power to demand it back, because that's what banks can do, right? That's the reason we feel so humbled when we go in there, is now we're indebted, and when you're indebted to someone, they own power over you. And Jesus is inviting us not to play that game. That's the alternative ethic here. Don't play that game. Give up that power. Give to someone who asks. Don't make them beg. Don't hold it over them. And don't demand it back. Alternative ethics. Never easy, but always intriguing. Okay, so in verse 31, we get what we commonly call the golden rule. And if you're a student of philosophy, you could relate this to Kant's categorical imperative or moral imperative, which actually comes out saying very much similarly the same thing. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And what I want to call this is an ego perspective approach to ethics. I would love to call it egocentric, right? But the way we use the word egocentric means that there's a centrifugal force where everything comes back to you. And I'm thinking more of that kind of centrifugal force where everything goes away from you. So I'll avoid the phrase egocentric and call it ego perspective. And what I mean by this is that it is simply true of the human condition that I see the world through my eyes. I think the thoughts that are in my head. I feel the feelings that are in my heart. I feel them, I think them, I see them innately. That's just what happens. And if I am to encounter somebody else as a subject, all right, so that's called subjectivity, right? I'm stuck in my subjectivity. If I'm to encounter someone else, I can encounter them as an object, just like I would, a thing. But that's one of the expressions of Kant's moral imperative, is never treat people as an end, as a means toward an end, but as an end in themselves. So we're to grant others the same kind of subjectivity that we inescapably have within ourselves. But in order for me to do that, it has to be a deliberate act, because I don't see through your eyes, and I don't think your thoughts, I don't feel your feelings, I don't share your convictions. So in order for me to be sensitive to your thoughts, it's more than just a matter of listening, but it's a type of listening. It's what Paul Ricoeur calls viewing oneself as another and viewing another as oneself. It's granting you the same subjectivity that I offer myself. And think about how this works. Like, if I mess up, I usually know why it happened, and I kind of give myself a pass. It's like, look, I wasn't thinking clearly, or I was a little confused, or I was angry, and to give myself a pass. I don't give other people that pass. If they mess up, I'm like, what the heck is wrong with you, right? This is kind of extending that love of self, that ego perspective, that subjectivity that we have to another. It has to be a deliberate act. It doesn't happen naturally. And in some respects, this is the ethic that Jesus is calling for in this verse. Treat others the way you want them to treat you. You know how you want others to treat you. Therefore, treat them that same way. It's like loving your neighbor as yourself. You know what you need in a loving relationship. Imagine that with your neighbor and offer that. So it's a different approach than what we heard earlier. It can be related. All of these are related, but it's just kind of a different slant in what we typically call the golden rule. And then in the next few verses, we have what I want to call comparative ethics. And I love this section. Comparative ethics can be over against leveraging ethics as a way of gaining someone's trust or gaining them to owe you something. This comparative ethics, Jesus calls that into question. Look, if you love those who love you back, if you do good to those who return it, if you lend to people who pay, so what? And then there's that great phrase Jesus keeps using, any old sinner can do that. What is that? So what? Our text translates the question, what credit is that to you? And this word credit is a translation of the word karitos, which we normally translate as grace. Grace. What credit is that to you? I don't want to go into why this is the case, but because there's the verb to be there, the word grace could be it's in the nominative case, which means it could be the subject or it could be the object. And I actually think one possibility for translating this question over and over again is Jesus asking, well, what is grace to you? If you only love those who love you back, what is grace to you? Is that a way of exercising grace? That sounds more calculative than loving. If you lend to those who are going to pay you back, what is grace to you? Does that sound like a life of grace? I really think part of what Jesus is doing here is comparing our approach to living a graceful life over against any old sinner. And look, any old sinner can do that because it's strategic. It makes sense. You get something out of it. But if you really embrace grace, what does it mean for you to embrace grace? Well, it means you love those who don't love you back. And you lend to those who cannot pay you back. And then you're not simply calculative, you're loving. So this is a comparative moment between those who embrace grace, followers of Christ, and any old sinner. And just love the way Jesus uses that phrase. And then the next few verses are what I would call imitative ethics, right? Love your enemies, do good, lend, expecting nothing in return. Jesus kind of gives a summation in verse 35 of the things he's been talking about. So he repeats them in a summary fashion, and he says, your reward will be great. And we think, oh, there it is. We knew that humans can't get away from needing a payoff, right? It's all about the reward. And we read it as if what Jesus is saying is, don't worry about your reward now. Just do all these good things, and when you get to heaven, you're going to have great rewards. But that's not really where Jesus takes us. He says your reward will be great, and you will be children of God. And then he ends with this phrase, be merciful as your Father is merciful. So the issue here is to imitate God. That's what it means to be children of God, is we are chips off the old block. We are sprigs from the same root. That's what it means to connect ourselves with God, is that we become bearers of God's own being within us. So this is an approach to ethics that's all about imitating your source of life. And of course, the language that the New Testament often uses with that is that God is our Father, and so we imitate God in that respect. And in verse 38, there's that phrase, be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. So you see the appropriation of the imitation ethic. This is actually a bit of a quote, but also an edited quote that we find elsewhere in the scriptures. You'll find it in Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5:48, that very difficult sentence that says, be perfect, therefore, as your Father is perfect. Teleoi. It is a little different from what we think of the word perfect, but that's not how Luke presents it here. He goes with the word merciful rather than perfect. It's also found in Leviticus, be holy as I am holy. But within this context of imitating God in places where there's enmity and haters and stuff like that, the way that we're holy as God is holy is that we practice mercy as God practices mercy. So that's an imitative ethic. And then we have what we might call boomerang ethics. Judge not, or you'll be judged. Don't condemn, or you'll be condemned. Forgive, or you'll be forgiven. So you can see how all of these actions come back. This is not karma, as people like to use that term, probably in a way that would be offensive to Buddhists. This is not payback. This is not pretending that there is some kind of moral fabric in the universe where every good act returns back to you. It doesn't seem to be that to me, as much as as a way of saying that we are cultivating a certain way of being. And when we cultivate that certain way of being, it can take root. This is more of a communal approach, rather than imagining that, one little individual in the world that's good to others will always end up having good back. I think it's more like when we're good, when we're not judging, when we're not condemning, when we're forgiving, when we're giving, we start to sow a new form of community that mutually reinforces everybody, and pretty in a way, non-judgmental forgiveness, giving, charity, all of that will become the way we are with one another. So I don't think it's so much about karma as it is about making a new community built on these values. Anyway, that's kind of my summation of all the different ethical approaches that are happening in this part of the sermon. On Wednesday, there'll be a discussion about this text. I will not be there for that, so Jean Coe will be leading that discussion, and she's got all the information you have, so she's going to do a good job. I think you'll enjoy that, and until then, I hope to hear from you. Thanks. Bye.